Let's begin where the pain is most acute. Because if you are here, if this title resonated with you, there is a reasonable chance that you have experienced one of the most disorienting and psychologically destabilizing events in the landscape of human relationships. You were discarded, and not just ended, because endings, even painful ones, carry a certain dignity when they are handled with honesty and care. No, what we're talking about is something qualitatively different. A dismissal, sudden or gradual withdrawal of someone who, not long before, made you feel like the most significant person in their world. In port of that withdrawal, you were left holding a question that I suspect has followed you into quiet moments, into sleepless nights, into the spaces between distraction and reality. What did I do wrong? Directly, and I want to answer that question directly, and I want to answer it first before we go anywhere else, because everything else I'm going to share with you today rests on the foundation of this single truth. The discard was not about you. It was never about you. Not your worth, not your adequacy, not the depth of your love, not the quality of your character, not the effort you invested, and not some fundamental flaw that made you ultimately unlovable. Discard was a transaction, and to understand why, we need to understand something essential about how the narcissistic mind relates to other people. A healthy psychological development, human beings gradually develop what theorists call object constancy, the capacity to hold a stable, nuanced, and enduring image of another person that persists even through conflict, disappointment, or distance. Then even use what allows you to be frustrated with someone you love and still love them. Pickings at first. It is what allows relationships to survive imperfection, because the whole person remains visible even when a particular moment is difficult. Object constancy is the psychological infrastructure of genuine love. Narcissistic personality organization is characterized at its developmental core by a profound disruption of this capacity. The narcissist does not experience people as whole, complex, continuous human beings. Taken story analysts describe as split representations, as either idealized objects, sources of perfect supply who confirm their grandiosity and soothe their internal void, or devalued objects, sources of frustration, disappointment, to where's two states is not gradual or rational. It is sudden, total, and driven entirely by the narcissist's internal experience rather than anything objectively true about you. Practical terms is that the discard was not the conclusion of a careful evaluation in which you were weighed and found wanting. It was the inevitable endpoint of a cycle that was structurally predetermined from the beginning. Idealization was never fully real. It was a projection, a fantasy of perfect supply onto a person they had not yet fully encountered. Discard were not a discovery of who you truly are. They were the collapse of that fantasy when the reality of your full, complex, beautifully imperfect humanity could no longer be contained within it. Despised because you were not, discarded because you were too little. As survivors come to understand that they were discarded precisely because they were too much, too authentic, too self-aware, too unwilling to disappear completely into the role that was assigned to them. They see it as not leave because they found you lacking. They leave because some part of them, however unconsciously, recognized that they could not control you completely. And complete control was always the only version of connection they were capable of sustaining. This reframe is not a consolation prize. It is not a gentle lie designed to make you feel better about something painful. It is psychologically precise, and it matters enormously. Something most people don't recognize the discard as a mechanical function of the narcissist's internal limitations, rather than a judgment on their own worth. Is a survivor who can begin to unhook their self-concept from an event that was never actually about them. The discard said nothing true about who you are. It said everything about what they are incapable of. The sooner you stop measuring your value through the lens of someone who was never equipped to see it clearly, the sooner you can begin to see yourself through the only lens that has ever mattered, your own. Here is the expanded segment for key point 2. Now that we've established what the discard actually was, and more importantly, what it was not, I want to take you inside the narcissist's psychological experience and the period that follows it, because there is something that happens after the discard that most survivors are never adequately prepared for, and the lack of preparation for it is responsible for an enormous amount of unnecessary pain and confusion in the recovery process. The narcissist moves on, quickly, often shockingly so. There is frequently a new person, sometimes one who was already present before the relationship officially ended, who is now receiving the full intensity of the idealization phase. Though, besavisaun, the love bombing, the grand gestures, the intoxicating attention that you remember from the beginning of your own relationship with them, Tory-eyes it first. And watching that happen, or hearing about it or seeing fragments of it surface on social media, produces a very specific kind of devastation in the survivor, because it appears to confirm the fear that was already whispering, that you were replaceable, that what you shared meant nothing, that they are in fact completely fine. But here's what that appearance conceals, and this is where the psychology becomes both fascinating and, for survivors, genuinely liberating. The new relationship is not a solution. It is a temporary patch over a wound that cannot be healed from the outside. Remember what we established in our earlier conversation. The narcissist does not possess a stable, internally generated sense of self. Dever amusingly, insuffer amusing tua, a performed identity that requires continuous external reinforcement to maintain its coherence, and that reinforcement has a half-life. People don't recognize it first. Every source of supply, no matter how potent in the beginning, eventually loses its capacity to deliver the required dose. The new person, however ideal they appear in the idealization phase, will inevitably become familiar. Pervin means human. Human means imperfect. And imperfect, to the narcissistic psyche, means no longer useful as a mirror of their grandiosity. This is the supply vacuum, entity at first, and it arrives with a reliability that is almost mathematical in its consistency. When the new source begins to fail, and the timeline varies, but the pattern does not, the narcissist experiences something that clinicians describe as narcissistic collapse, destabilization of the constructed self that manifests as anxiety, rage, depression, or a frantic compulsive reaching for alternative sources of validation. Their mind inevitably travels back through its inventory of previous supply sources. Texture, not because they have grown, not because they have reflected, not because genuine remorse has produced a genuine reckoning with the harm they caused. You re-enter, Texture, because the vacuum is real, because the discomfort of internal emptiness is intolerable, and because you represented a source of supply significant enough to be remembered. I want to be very precise here, because the language we use to describe this process matters enormously for how survivors interpret it. What the narcissist experiences in this moment is not the rekindling of love. It is the reactivation of appetite. There is a profound and non-negotiable difference between those two things, and collapsing them, which the survivor's trauma bond and residual hope will desperately want to do. In most dangerous cognitive moves available in the recovery process, think of it in purely biological terms for a moment. When a person is hungry, they do not necessarily return to the last meal they ate because it was meaningful. They because it was available, because they know what it tastes like, because the effort required to access it is familiar and therefore lower than the effort required to find something new. Torgi, the narcissist's return, operates on a strikingly similar logic. You are known. You are mapped. Your emotional architecture has already been studied and cataloged. The specific pressure points that generate supply have already been identified. Returning to you requires significantly less energy than building that knowledge base with someone entirely new. This is not romantic. This is not romantic. This is not redemption. This is ever-jurse management by a psyche that has run low on fuel. And yet, and this is the part that requires the most honest examination, knowing all of this does not automatically dissolve the pull. Because the trauma bond that was formed during the relationship does not consult your intellect before it responds to their reappearance. It responds to the familiar, to the voice, the energy, the presence of someone who's intermittent. Warmth, your nervous system spent months or years organizing itself around. the cognitive understanding of what is happening and the visceral experience of what is happening can exist in profound tension with each other. Tension is not a failure of your recovery. It is the most human possible response to an extraordinarily complex psychological situation. The supply vacuum that brings them back to you is not evidence of your irreplaceability. It is evidence of their incompleteness. They did not return because they finally recognized your worth. They returned because they have not yet developed the internal resources to survive without consuming someone else's. And that is not a reason to open the door. Tasks, that is the most important reason to keep it closed. Here is the expanded segment for key point 3. So we've established what the discard was, and we've established what happens internally for the narcissist in the vacuum that follows it, terming. But as one of the most disorienting aspects of the revaluation experience for survivors is that it often feels like it arrives from nowhere. In mind, there is silence, absence, the unmistakable message that you no longer exist in their world, and then, suddenly, you do again. A message, appearance, derive, bigger fence, mentioning your name came up, and the survivor is left trying to make sense of the timing, trying to understand what, specifically, flip the switch. This is not random. Nothing about narcissistic behavior is truly random, even when it appears that way from the outside. Make that reevaluation has a trigger, and understanding that trigger with precision, without romanticism, is one of the most protective things a survivor can do for their own continued recovery. Walk you through the most common triggers, because they tend to cluster around a specific set of themes, and the thread running through all of them. Once you see it, you cannot unsee. The first and perhaps most powerful trigger is visible healing. When a survivor begins to genuinely recover, when they reemerge socially, when the grief lifts enough to allow joy back into their face, when they are seen laughing again, building again, inhabiting their life with a fullness that was absent during the relationship. This registers in the narcissist's psychology with extraordinary force. Remember that the narcissist's constructed identity often incorporates a narrative in which the people they discard are diminished by the loss of them. Your suffering, however painful for you, was unconsciously confirming for them. It validated the story they told themselves about their own significance. Your healing dismantles that story. Dismantled story requires a response. Closely related to this is the trigger of a new relationship. Few things activate narcissistic revaluation as rapidly or as intensely as the knowledge that you have moved on to someone else. First, and I want you to understand the psychology behind this with absolute clarity, because it is easy to misinterpret it as jealousy born of love, and that misinterpretation is precisely what the narcissist's reappearance is designed, however unconsciously, to exploit. What they are experiencing is not the pain of lost love. It is the injury of lost ownership. To side of you choosing someone else, investing your emotional energy and your intimacy in another person, triggers the ownership wound at the core of the narcissistic injury. You were their resource. Resources are not supposed to find alternative uses. Then there is the trigger of social or professional elevation. A public achievement, a new social circle that carries status, a creative project that receives recognition. Any visible increase in your social currency reactivates your perceived value as a supply source. The narcissist is exquisitely attuned to status. It is one of the primary currencies through which they measure both themselves and others. When your status rises, so does your utility. And utility, as we have established, is the only lens through which they relate to other people. There is perhaps the most psychologically revealing trigger of all, your indifference. When a narcissist becomes aware, through whatever channel, that you have genuinely stopped caring, that you no longer monitor their movements, no longer react to their provocations, no longer carry the emotional charge of someone still tethered to the dynamic. True indifference, as we discussed in our earlier conversation, is the one thing the narcissistic system has no defense against. Paradoxically, it is also one of the things most likely to provoke revaluation, because a person who has genuinely stopped caring is a person who has withdrawn supply so completely that the void it creates becomes impossible to ignore. There is the pattern that connects all of these triggers, and I want you to hold it clearly because it is both simple and profound. Every single trigger for narcissistic revaluation is about you changing in a way that affects their supply calculation. Bad, you becoming more loving, not you becoming more forgiving, not some quality of your character finally being recognized and appreciated. The trigger is always, without exception, a shift in your perceived value as a resource. Your healing made you more interesting. Your new relationship made you scarce. Your success made you more socially valuable. Your indifference made you unreachable. Ace, the revaluation is a response to a supply-related variable, and not one of those variables has anything to do with who you genuinely are as a person. This is the distinction that survivors must burn into their understanding before the revaluation contact arrives, because it will arrive when you are most changed, which means it will arrive when you are most healed, Tushin will arrive at the exact moment when the trauma bond, still present in your nervous system, is most capable of interpreting their return as meaningful. The trigger for their return was never your lovability, it was your unavailability. And a person who only returns when you become harder to reach has not had a change of heart. They have had a change of strategy. Do not confuse the two. To breathe was never meant to be bait. Do not let it become one. Here is the expanded segment for Key Point 4. We have now arrived at the moment that every survivor needs to be prepared for, not theoretically, not abstractly, but with the kind of granular, practical clarity that actually holds up when the moment arrives in real life. People don't recognize at first because intellectual understanding and embodied readiness are two very different things, and the gap between them is exactly where the narcissist revaluation campaign does its most effective work. The Hoovering campaign has begun. You may not have named it yet, you may not have even recognized it for what it is in the moment it arrives. That is precisely by design, because the narcissist's re-entry strategy is rarely announced as such. It does not arrive wearing a sign that reads, "I am attempting to reassert control over you." It arrives wearing the faces of things you were conditioned, over the entire course of the relationship, to respond to with hope. So let me walk you through those faces that make them so recognizable that when they appear, and for many of you, they either already have or they will, you will see them clearly, name them accurately, and respond from a place of informed choice rather than reflexive emotional reaction. The first and most immediately destabilizing face of Hoovering is vulnerability. The narcissist reaches out not with demands or declarations, but with apparent fragility. They are struggling. They are unwell. Something has happened. A loss, a crisis, a moment of genuine or performed suffering. And you, specifically, are the person they have turned to. This is not accidental. First, people don't recognize it first. They know your empathy. They mapped it during the relationship with extraordinary precision. Tations made. But your care for others is not a casual quality, but a deep, constitutive part of who you are. And they are using it, deliberately or instinctively, consciously or not, as the precise key for the precise lock they spent years studying. For survivors who identify strongly as caregivers, as empaths, as people whose sense of self is partly organized around their capacity to show up for others in pain, this particular face of Hoovering is the most dangerous. People don't recognize it first, because it does not ask you to forgive them. It does not ask you to re-enter the relationship. It decants you to be kind to someone who appears to be suffering. And kindness, for many survivors, does not feel like a choice. It feels like a moral obligation, which is exactly why it is chosen as a weapon. Then there is the face of transformation. The narcissist returns with evidence, with a performance of evidence, that they have changed, they have been in therapy, they have had a revelation. They have finally, after everything, understood the harm they caused and genuinely reckon with it. They use the specific language of accountability that they know you always needed to hear. They name the behaviors. They express remorse with what appears to be real emotional depth. Survivor who spent months or years longing for exactly this acknowledgement, for the simple, dignified experience of having their reality confirmed by the person who spent so long dismantling it. This can feel like the resolution of the deepest wound in the entire experience. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to make a categorical claim that people never change. Change is possible. Growth is real, but there is a meaningful clinical distinction between genuine therapeutic transformation, which is slow, structural, and evidenced by consistent behavioral change over time, and the performed transformation of a narcissist in supply crisis, which is urgent, perfectly calibrated to your specific emotional needs, and conspicuously timed to coincide with the exact moment their other supply sources have failed. One of these is a process. The other is a pitch, and the difference between them becomes visible not in the conversation, where the transformation is declared, but in the months of behavior that follow it, which you will never get to observe if you re-enter the dynamic before that evidence exists. There is also the face of casual recontact, no grand declarations, no apparent crisis, no performance of transformation, simply a message, a memory shared, 28ed and first. A song that apparently reminded them of you, a question so mundane it seems almost impossible to interpret as strategic. This is perhaps the most sophisticated form of hoovering because it asks nothing of you, or appears to ask nothing, while actually asking everything. It is designed to reopen a channel of communication with the lowest possible resistance, to reestablish contact so gradually and so innocuously that by the time the dynamic begins to reassert itself, you are already inside it. What all of these faces share, the vulnerability, the transformation, the casual re-contact, is that they are oriented entirely around your known response patterns. They are not expressions of the narcissist's authentic emotional experience. They are reflections of your emotional architecture, thrown back at you with surgical precision. The narcissist is not reaching out because they have finally seen you clearly. They are reaching out because they remember exactly how you work. The next to be fully installed before the hovering arrives, because in the moment it arrives, your nervous system will not immediately care about psychology or patterns or supply vacuums. Your nervous system will recognize a familiar voice, a familiar energy, a familiar promise of the thing it spent years organizing itself around. The moment, the only thing standing between you and re-entry into a cycle that has not fundamentally changed is the clarity you be. And at first, before the contact came, hoovering is not a homecoming, it is a harvesting. And the most powerful response available to you is not a confrontation, not an explanation, not a final declaration of everything they put you through. In the nukovo, whether renegings of first place, silence, stillness, and the unshakable knowledge that you have already survived the hardest part, and you will not be returning to it. Here is the expanded segment for Key Point 55, Tation with By Could, at the heart of narcissistic revaluation, that I want to examine carefully, because it is one of the most psychologically disorienting experiences a survivor can navigate, and yet it receives very little attention in the standard conversation around narcissistic abuse recovery. It is the paradox of simultaneous threat and desire, the experience of being, at the exact same moment, both the thing the narcissist wants to reclaim and the thing they want to destroy. And if you have ever felt, during or after the reevaluation contact, simultaneous at first, as though the narcissist was simultaneously pursuing you and punishing you, as though their interest in reconnecting carried within it a strange, unmistakable undercurrent of hostility. This is the explanation you have been looking for. Hold this carefully, because the layers matter. When a survivor heals visibly, when they rebuild their life, reclaim their identity, re-emerge into the world as someone who is clearly, demonstrably thriving without the narcissist, tonality, and first they produce two simultaneous and deeply contradictory responses in the narcissist psychological system. The first response is injury, profound, destabilizing narcissistic injury, because your thriving is, at the level of the narcissist's unconscious narrative, a direct challenge to the story they told themselves about the discard. That story, the one that allowed them to discard you without confronting the reality of what they were doing, required you to be diminished by their absence. And it required the implicit confirmation that they were the source of your value, your joy, your capacity to function. Your healing does not just contradict that story, it demolishes it. And a demolishes story for a psyche built entirely on narrative control is an existential threat. But here is where the paradox deepens. Because at the same moment that you're healing injured them, it also intensifies their desire to reacquire you. And the mechanism behind this is both psychologically precise and, once understood, deeply clarifying. Torn rise at first, a person who is visibly thriving is a person who is generating something, energy, joy, social momentum, a quality of aliveness that is visible to others. Generative quality is, in the narcissist's perceptual framework, an extraordinarily potent form of supply. The passive supply of someone waiting to be rescued, not the desperate supply of someone still in the grip of the trauma bond, but the high-quality supply of someone who has rebuilt themselves into something genuinely worth consuming. Your healing, in other words, made you more valuable to them. Not as a person. They remain constitutionally incapable of valuing you as a person. Bruiser recognize at first. But as a resource irony of the entire dynamic is this: the work you did to free yourself from them is the very work that made them want you back. To him stand, not because it should discourage your healing, it should absolutely not, and we will return to that, but because it explains a specific confusion that many survivors experience when the revaluation contact arrives. Confusion of feeling simultaneously seen and unsafe. Because in a very particular sense, you are being seen, your growth is being perceived and registered with accuracy. People don't recognize it first. But what is doing the perceiving is not love, not admiration of your worth. It is appetite. It is the predatory attunement of a system that has identified a high-quality supply source and is moving to reacquire it. It desires the hostility, because the narcissist cannot fully separate their wanting you from their resenting you, from making them want you. Your independence is both attractive and infuriating to them. Your healing is both desirable and threatening. The version of you that exists now, grounded, boundaried, no longer organized around their needs, is simultaneously the version they most want access to and the version they are least equipped to control. Combination, desire plus threatened control, is one of the most volatile psychological configurations in the narcissistic personality. What this means practically is that the revaluation campaign will rarely feel purely warm. Dialization, the familiar intoxication of their focused attention. But woven through, it will be subtle tests, provocations. But woven through will be subtle tests, provocations. Teen recalibrations designed to locate the edges of your new boundaries and assess whether the old dynamic can be reasserted. They are not just pursuing you, they are auditing you, trying to determine whether the version of you that exists now is one they can still operate within, still shape, still ultimately direct. The survivor who understands this paradox is immunized against one of the revaluation campaign's most effective tools, the flattery of being wanted. Because being wanted by a narcissist who has revalued you is not the same as being loved, seen, or genuinely cherished. It is being assessed for reinstatement. It is not about your worth as a human being. It is about your utility as a supply source. And specifically, whether the boundaries you have built can be gradually, carefully, systematically dismantled once you are back inside the dynamic. Your healing was never meant to make you more attractive to the person you healed from. It was meant to make you more available to yourself. Narcissist returns, drawn by the very transformation that was supposed to set you free. The most powerful thing you can understand is this: they are not responding to who you have become. They are responding to what you now represent. Do not open that mistake for love pull you back into being someone else's meal. I want to spend some time with a word that doesn't get examined carefully enough in the context of narcissistic relationships. And that word is ownership. Because I think when we use the word love to describe what a narcissist feels during the revaluation and repursuit phase, we're not just being imprecise, We are actively obscuring the psychological reality in a way that costs survivors enormously. Cost is this: when you believe someone is returning because they love you, you evaluate their return through the framework of love, with its associated possibilities of growth, forgiveness, and genuine reconnection. But when you understand that what they are experiencing is the activation of an ownership wound, the entire situation looks different, and it requires an entirely different response. So let me be as precise as I can about what ownership means in this context and why it sits at the center of the narcissistic revaluation. From the earliest stages of a relationship with a narcissist, the dynamic that is being established beneath the surface of whatever romantic or relational narrative is being performed is one of acquisition. The love bombing, the intense attunement, the experience of being seen and chosen with such overwhelming specificity, all of it is, at a functional level, the process of claiming. Narcissist is not falling in love with you in the way that term implies mutual vulnerability and genuine emotional risk. They are incorporating you, answers, absorbing you into their extended sense of self, making you, in the most psychologically precise sense of the word, theirs. Relations theorists describe this as the narcissist's inability to experience others as fully separate, autonomous beings with their own independent inner worlds. The people into narcissist life are not, at the level of their psychological experience, genuinely other. They are extensions, satellites, reflective surfaces that exist in relational orbit around the narcissist's constructed self, deriving their meaning and their value entirely from their proximity to and service of that center. This is not a metaphor. This is a clinical description of how the narcissistic psyche actually organizes its relational world. What this means for the discard is something we touched on earlier, but what it means for the revaluation is something we need to examine with fresh precision. Discards you, they do not, at the level of their internal psychological experience, fully release you, because you are never, in their framework, a separate person who could be fully released. You are an extension of them, a possession. Possessions, even ones that have been set aside, do not stop belonging to the person who set them aside simply because they are no longer being actively used. This is why the sight of you moving on, building a new life, entering a new relationship, flourishing in ways that make your independence from them visible and real, does not register for the narcissist as the natural, legitimate consequence of a relationship that ended. That registers as a violation, as something being taken that still, in some deeply irrational but psychologically genuine sense, belongs to them. The ownership wound is not triggered by love lost. It is triggered by control lost, by the perception that something they considered theirs is no longer available for their use, no longer oriented around their needs, no longer defined by its relationship to them. That distinction between love and ownership, between genuine emotional loss and the injury of lost control, is one of the most liberating reframes available to a survivor navigating the revaluation experience. Because when you understand that what drove them back to you was not the recognition of your worth, but the activation of their ownership instinct, you are freed from the most dangerous interpretation available in that moment. Interpretation that their return means you were always loved, that the relationship contains something real that is now being honestly acknowledged. But this time with this evidence of their desire, something genuinely different is possible. Nothing is different. The ownership wound that brought them back is the same psychological configuration that made the relationship damaging in the first place. Thus, a person who relates to others as possessions does not suddenly develop the capacity for genuine mutuality because they experience the discomfort of losing access to something they considered theirs. Discomfort of loss and the growth required to love differently are not the same experience, and they do not produce the same outcomes. There is something else I want to name here, something that survivors rarely hear articulated, but that many of them feel and are confused by. When the narcissist returns with apparent desire and intensity, there can be a part of the survivor, a part that has been working very hard to rebuild self-worth after the discard, that experiences their return as validating, time so formant that they were after all, worth coming back for. And I want to address that part directly with both honesty and compassion. That feeling is completely understandable. It is the entirely human response of a person whose sense of value was systematically attacked by someone who is now, apparently, reversing their verdict. But I want you to understand why that validation is not just insufficient, it is actively dangerous. Because it reestablishes the narcissist as the authority on your worth. It resent, kier, by which you measure your own value. And that recentering is in a very real sense the first step back into the dynamic, long before any explicit decision to re-engage has been made. Your worth was never theirs to assign. It was never theirs to withdraw. And it is not theirs to restore. The return of someone who discarded you is not a certificate of your value. And when a narcissist comes back for you, they are not returning with love. They are not returning with love. They are returning with a deed. Document they drew up the moment they decided you belonged to them, that they never actually surrendered, and that they are now attempting to reinforce. Tomoer, arriving with a deed to your soul, is to remind them clearly and completely that you are not property. You never were, and you are no longer available to be claimed.